Welcome to Chapter 1, our very first narrated slideshow, where we'll get a nice introduction to the field of lifespan development and the kinds of things, people, and concepts that will be a part of it moving forward. As you can see, we call this lifespan development. Sometimes people refer to similar courses as developmental psych. Oftentimes developmental psych will focus almost exclusively on child development. Here in this class, we're going to talk about every aspect or part of the lifespan from birth, even conception, all the way to death and dying at the end of the lifespan. We'll also talk about ways to break down the life course. What are some things that are normal? Milestones, accomplishments, achievements, and how is that specific or universal between or across different cultures? Of course, with any social science perspective, we also have to think about the theoretical and historical background. Where did these perspectives come from? What were some of the notable people who were towering names in the field of lifespan development as we know it today? Here's a view of pictures in terms of how we break down our coverage of the lifespan. If you think about all human development from conception to death, that's a whole lot of stuff to include. And of course, you can imagine we can't cover it all in this class. So we generally divide it up into these three basic categories, including physical development. We'll even do some genetics at the start of the semester. We'll always talk about what's happening with the brain through each period or age range of the lifespan that we address. We'll also talk about psychosocial aspects as well. And finally, we'll talk about some cognitive things such as when does attachment develop and what does it look like? And how does that relate to later on development of things like emotional and self-regulation? So we'll organize most of the concepts we cover along the lines of these three basic groups of development. One thing that, as we begin our discussion of lifespan, we might want to think about is the concept of generations. And you can see generations in the United States by thousands of people. And you can see the baby boomers earned their name by having a lot higher rates of fertility or creating new kids. And this baby boomer generation has been very profitable for the country because they've produced a lot of workers that were putting money and value into the economy without drawing much out. But of course, now we've reached the time where many baby boomers are retiring and that ratio is switching. So we see there are relatively fewer Generation Xers to support the baby boomers that are now moving into closer to large retirements. Another way to think about lifespan is, again, through classifying people or grouping people. And of course, we're still sticking to the general generations. Again, the common terms we're familiar with: millennials, Generation Xers, baby boomers, and the silent or the greatest generation. I think there's also a lot of pseudoscience out there that sort of makes some theory that's not necessarily based on good data and makes very broad generalizations about you just based on your generation or the year or year range in which you were born. So again, if we want to look at people through the view of labels, we have to also understand there is a lot of error in doing so. It's just a very, very broad label to be able to think we understand somebody with. We can also look at fertility rates. So this is population by year of birth and birth rate. Of course, the baby boomers, as we talked about before, had a lot higher rate relatively, and those rates tailed off with Generation X and then have crept up a little bit. And those will have key implications for the health of an economy, the health of a country, as we'll talk about in just a little bit. We also see many other important things that, again, this very broad, rough label, the general 20-year range that you were born into, there's big differences in terms of which generation gets their news or their information from. I'm sure there's plenty of people watching who haven't watched CNN or major news or Fox News in a long time. We're still learning out some of the implications involved with that in terms of where people get their information, what they think about the world, how well that information is verified or close to fact versus far away from accepted fact. And I think we're going to continue to think about news consumption and learning about our society and world in general in terms of different generations. Continuing our logic of the value of looking at different cohorts, and again, similar to the idea of generations where we're looking at 20-year age ranges and who was born within them and giving them a label. Here we take a more, what we might call fine-grained look at that. So instead of 20-year age ranges, now we're looking at 5-year age ranges of different cohorts. So this is the age 60 to 64 cohort as of the year 2014. What does this tell us? Well, this is what's called a population pyramid. You take the United States population in this date and then divide it between genders, and you can see relative how many people are age 100 plus compared to how many people are in the traditional working range versus how many are still in the learning childhood education range. And what we see here is what looks in many cases to be a healthy economy as far as population, because you see lots of people in middle age who are contributing the most value to the economy, and relatively few people in the upper age ranges that are more expensive and more costly that have to be supported by the younger age ranges. And finally, we look at, is there still enough in the younger generations coming through to be able to support what is passing through and getting older? And it looks like for the most part there is. The baby boomers are going to have this big bubble that comes through and has to collect on health insurance, health care, Social Security, and those are going to be issues that are going to be important to us to have to deal with as a society. But just looking at the population pyramid of the US, it's nothing to panic about. Contrast that to some other countries. We can see Egypt. Here we see very few people at the older ranges, very few relatively in terms of middle age. So something like this is potentially dangerous for an economy because you have a whole bunch of younger kids that need to be supported and can be costly. We also see a lot of upcoming working class that is ready for jobs, but in some cases, like Egypt, if there aren't jobs and the economy isn't functioning well, this is often a recipe for, if they can't work, they're going to find something else to do, and one out of many possible indicators of potential violence and religious extremism. Now let's look at Germany. If we talked about the US baby boom, their baby boom is much larger. You see how much it's sticking out. Once they reach retirement ages, that is going to be a problem. And you can see many more, relative to Egypt especially, live to be older. And we see a big gender difference. Many more women relative to men live to be in their 80s and 90s in Germany. And we also see the effect of very low fertility in the youngest generations. So not only is this bubble really sticking out when this group is retiring and drawing on social services and the economy, we also won't have the relative support of the younger generations. So there's some potential things to worry about, although there are many other aspects of Germany that suggest it is a very positive and strong economy. Now let's look at the case of China. China relatively close to these years, partially due to the one child, one family policies. There's this big middle-aged middle class that has been just pumping value into the economy for decades. And traditionally, they would probably still have another decade or two, but once this big bulge reaches the 70s, they're going to want more social services than previous generations wanted or felt they could demand. And there's relatively fewer young workers to be able to support that giant bubble. And of course, if you look at the numbers, 4 million men and women in Germany. Now we're dealing with 65 men and women in China. That number gets even bigger once we project to 2050. And again, this is when this golden age, demographically speaking, on this population pyramid, some of those benefits are going to have to pay the toll for that. And again, very not being offset by the younger generations. And this is going to be, on the face of it, a recipe for economic struggle. But enough about population pyramids. I promise we'll come back to them at the end of the semester as we zoom out once again in these large scale patterns. But let's zoom in and get started with some of the things that are essential to our lifespan perspective. So first of all, we see our definition of development, basically changes in patterns beginning at conception. We'll see a lot of nature versus nurture discussion for pretty much anything we want to talk about that develops, from personality to intelligence to preferences for music or politics even. Also want to take a subset of things that fall under the development into what we refer to as maturation. So maturation is more like a physical program in that it's more predictable, more common across people as they develop. So for example, the onset of puberty. It's a maturational process. It typically happens at about the same age. It's predictable and will stay predictable as long as there's enough in the environment to allow that to happen. Just like you start up a computer, you know how it starts up. Same thing with maturation. Unless the computer doesn't have power or unless there's a virus, that startup process or that maturational process in humans will work very predictably. I used a couple examples here because does someone's development support what we would have predicted based on their genes and their environment before? And of course we have Peyton Manning. His father was a famous quarterback. His brothers were famous quarterbacks. And no surprise, there's another Manning coming that's one of the best high school quarterbacks. So everything would have predicted that he would have one of the best chances of anybody to achieve the success of playing football quarterback that he did. On the other hand, we have Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, who grew up in a very normal upper middle class environment, and he got a PhD in mathematics, I believe, and in his mid-20s, which is often an inflection point that we'll find out later on, started to have some disturbing views of society, moved to a cabin in Montana, and started delivering mail bombs. So in that case, there's nothing genetic. There wasn't a major history of psychological disorder in his family. It was something that happened that was largely unpredictable. And of course, we have good situations and genes that may result in bad outcomes, but we can also have bad situations. This is Alice Walker, Nobel Poet Laureate, grew up abused and grew up very poor. Her parents were sharecroppers, but of course she had tremendous professional success as a writer and poet. And so again, another case where we know that things generally predict good development, bad development, average development, but we see there's a lot of variability. And just because some things line up to predict something is no guarantee that that's the way it's going to play out. One thing I want us to be very familiar with, and which I'm sure we will be by the end of the semester, is Erikson's psychosocial stage theory. And basically, aside from this chapter where we're still doing an intro to lifespan development, this is how we're going to organize the rest of the semester. And you can see chapters 2 and 3, which will end up being exam 1, are lined up here. Chapters generally 4, 5, and 6 line up to these chunks of the lifespan. And then we have the adulthood years that are our final chapters for this semester. And the key to keep in mind with Erikson's stages is that, again, it's psychosocial development. In particular, he was concerned with the development and maturation of the sense of self. So how do we see ourselves and know who we are and what we want? And then by extension, how do we experiment and learn about how to actually get those things that we want? And you can see a lot of this is basically, do we have basic trust in our world in our first year of life? Do we feel that if we act, it can lead to things that we want? Now, we've got a sense of self about what makes us proud, what makes other people proud of us. Can we continue to work to do those things? Can we also tie those things to other things that have meaning, such as getting good grades or being recognized for achievement in sports and music? And then finally, adolescence. We get to the idea of identity versus confusion, and we'll find out that Erikson thought it was a good idea for teenagers to try out lots of identities so that once you hit early adulthood, you'll have a strong sense of self of who you are, and then you can choose intimacy to reinforce who you are and the life you want to lead with other people and build lasting, helpful, supportive, psychologically strong relationships. Then the adulthood, we have 40 years roughly here, where generativity is your chance to be productive. Just like on those population pyramids, it's a big chance where you are contributing not only to your family and your community, but also to your larger economy, both state-wise and nationally. Finally, we get to some of the retirement ages where your body might be breaking down a little bit. You may not be able to work full-time. And you can look back on your achievements either with integrity or despair and anger and frustration. And of course, Erikson would say, you want to move to the left side of all of these and avoid the right side for a rough blueprint for a healthy, happy life. There's lots of people right now who think that they're going to try and live to be 120, 130, 150 even. Some people, some billionaires are spending money on that. We'll see if that's possible. I'm pretty skeptical. But I think the idea with the stage theory, going back to Erikson, is that you can't really skip steps. So if you decide, I just don't really care about early adulthood, I'm going to do whatever I want, Erikson would say, sure, you can kind of recapture some of that later on, but you can't just live the rest of your life in the healthiest way that if you had moved through it normally when you were at that important age. So that's important to keep in mind. You can't skip steps. Here we see some general variables that we'll come to off and on throughout the semester. One is this idea of culture. So if we talk about nature and nurture, culture is definitely the nurture or the environment part. We think about national cultures compared to others, but we can also have smaller cultures within regions or religions or even customs. A lot of what we identify as culture is actually a social construction. So sometimes we often attribute traits to genetics, and we over-attribute the influence of genetics. So as we'll find out, especially with Chapter 2, genetics can partially explain a lot of things, but there are very few things that they can explain most of, or even half of, especially things that are a product of our choices, our education, our occupational history. Related to occupational history, we see socioeconomic status. This is a variable you'll see used a lot. One thing to keep in mind is that it's some sort of combination of education, work history, job attainment, and some applications of socioeconomic status, or SES, will use different combinations to make that variable. So sort of like how a sausage gets made, it might look good and it might actually predict and relate to a lot of important variables. But just from a sheer statistical point, if these are all going into it, let's just look at all these types of variables separately as opposed to just matching them all up into socioeconomic status. But sometimes we won't be able to avoid that. We also have the idea of gender and race. Normally you think about race as pretty easy to see the color of someone's skin or other physical features. Same thing with gender. You normally assume that you're born with the parts that you have, and that determines what box you fill in the survey. But I think what we're finding out, and what there's a lot of research to support, is that your race and gender is not really expressed much in terms of controlling things about you. What it does is provide something for people to look at you and quickly categorize you and make a lot of assumptions about you. And again, related to the top of this slide, we are much too fast to make assumptions about somebody based on what we think their gender or racial ethnic status identification is. So with gender and race, again, we think about it as just a straightforward physical characteristic that explains a lot about a person, but in fact it's just a visible characteristic that we overassume a lot of other things about and probably shouldn't, going to the idea of these having much more of a social construction element than just straightforward biological expression. We'll talk about parenting styles in the next 4 or 5 chapters. And the general idea is good genes are something that we all want, and they predict good things for our kids. The problem is good genes in many cases can't overcome very abusive or very limited environments. So with many things, there is a nature-nurture, gene-environment interaction, and of course, a parent who's just smart and passes on those genes that would predict high intelligence can't just ignore his or her responsibilities and expect the development to play out just fine, which pretty much any non-neglectful parent will fundamentally understand. I always like to use this as an example when I'm talking about the social construction of race and gender, and in this case, age, another common demographic variable. This movie is the classic Clint Eastwood Get Off My Lawn, Gran Torino. And what we find out first in the movie is that Clint Eastwood is very suspicious and untrustworthy or untrusting of his Hmong neighbors. He sees that they look different from him, talk different from him, and he's scared of them. What he finds out, though, by the end of the movie, is that his neighbors identify with the kind of family values, togetherness and support, and focus on continual reinforcement and comfort, and that he identifies more with the family values of his previously, what he thought, different neighbors compared to his own family, who were very self-involved and tech-absorbed and focused on acquiring things rather than meaningful relationships. So it's a good example of the journey that I think once we look past obvious physical characteristics, we realize the limitations in making too many attributions about them. We'll find a lot of studies that are useful to us to take a deeper dive into throughout the semester. This is one of my favorite ones. It's known as the Perry Preschool Project. What's interesting to me is that it took place in fairly close area, Ypsilanti, Michigan. And basically the idea was that this was a straightforward experiment, and you have a group of students who are preschool aged and randomly assign half of them to not have funding for free preschool, and randomly assign the other to get lucky and have free funding or publicly paid for preschool. And we're also going to see that this is a longitudinal study and that we're tracking a group over time. So you follow up these preschool students. The only difference is that some had free preschool paid for, the others didn't. Now track them into adulthood over time and see if you find differences. And what do you know? A small thing, such as free preschool, seems to have major effects later on down the line. So we see 5 or more arrests. If you did not get the free preschool, you're 5 times more likely to have 5 or more arrests. 4 times almost more likely to have been arrested for drugs. Twice as likely to need public assistance as an adult. More births out of wedlock. Big difference in overall earnings per month. 3 times less likely to have own your own home if you did not have free preschool, and less likely to pursue post-high school education. So this is going to be one of many examples that we'll find throughout the semester of what I like to call an investment that if we invest in our kids, and I think most of us would clearly answer yes, we want to support our kids and give them the best chance for successful lives later on. And a lot of times these investments can be very small relative to the size of investments to make major policy changes like Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. And I think little things like this, maybe a plan or a policy for funding for free preschool, can have a big bang for its buck later on in terms of being part of a developmental environment that helps kids become much more productive members of society. Won't spend too much time on this, but I did want to show that there are some links to brain development that are also linked to if you grow up in different socioeconomic status environments. And we're generally going to go with more of this red. You grew up in an environment that could pay for more stuff. Red, in this case, has been contrasted to be more developed or faster. I don't know the exact details here. We'll find some ways in which a healthy brain for an adolescent looks different than one that is less healthy. And yet another example of everybody has to go through the same stages of life through childhood, but some have many more opportunities, some have many less things that they have to be scared for, such as if they have a place to sleep, if they have a safe place to play, all those kinds of things. And one last important point about this is that once we get to brain development in adolescence, it might be nice to think if they could just catch up. But once brain development has gotten to the adolescent stage, if it is not as high of a ceiling as it could have been, chances are you can't just make that up later, right? You've placed an artificial ceiling on the uppermost development or potential of our kids, and we want to avoid doing that in any way we can. A couple points to consider. We'll talk a lot about individual differences this semester. And basically, individual differences can represent all sorts of different variables. We'll often talk about ones such as, for example, cognitive stages. Which stage are you at? Is that where you should be relative to your age? We'll talk about personality. We'll talk about intelligence a lot. But this can be all sorts of other different things too, such as diet. Are you eating a healthy diet or an unhealthy diet? Are you hungry, or do you have enough calories to eat? And we can even talk about things such as ambition, humor, sports preference, music preference. All these things can be considered individual difference variables. Now, the one thing to consider is that they're often used as control variables in research, like the Perry Preschool Project, right? All they wanted to say was these kids generally were about the same, except that one group got the free preschool, the other didn't. And we only care about that one, the effect of that one manipulation. But you can also look at the non-experimental, the correlational view, where all these individual differences we want to measure and see if they have any effects, see if they predict things, important outcomes later on in time. So sometimes individual differences are viewed as noise that you just want to adjust or control out of the main effect you're looking at, but other times they can be the primary focus of a study. One thing that's going to be very important for us in this first exam period is the idea of a critical period. Critical, it's as important as the name sounds. Basically, it's something that is essential. What this means is that for a certain thing to develop, we can tie a general age, starting at this age, ending at that age, and if they're not exposed to the environmental things that they need to be exposed to in that window, then it can be too late. So for example, there's evidence for critical periods of language development. As we'll find out, the entire language window is huge. It's from before birth to, let's say, early adolescence. Others have smaller critical period windows. So visual perception, let's say a child is born with cataracts or basically locked in an attic upstairs, and those pathways that need to form in the first less than a year of life, if they don't get the stimulation they need to form, they can't grow back later. That person will never be able to see like a normal adult, and it's a product of an environmental condition that happened in the first year of life. Also in the first year of life, we have the idea of attachment. So this is your basic trust and love in at least one other person in your life as a baby. Any normal parent is going to make sure to provide plenty of any of that support for a baby. But in the case of historically large-scale orphanages is based in on what we now view as some very neglectful public health planning. Some large groups of babies were just forked over to the government and were provided with very little attention. And even through adulthood, they never were able to develop normal attachment or basic trust that the world wasn't out to get them at all times. Sometimes we'll talk about a sensitive period, meaning the age range seems to be there, but we're less clear on what that range is. There's a little fuzziness. For our purposes, we're going to consider them the same as a critical period. Now, the big point is that critical periods are rare. So there's a few major ones that every parent and every educator should know. For example, as far as I know, there's no critical period for muscle development. So even if your child isn't walking at age 1.5, and it seems like every other 1.5-year-old you see is walking, well, that's not a critical period. As long as there's nothing physically wrong with their legs, chances are it'll come. You're just at the late range of the curve. And of course, most things that we have to learn as non-babies are plastic, meaning we might not get a head start, but we can catch up to some extent. Our brain might not represent, and in fact won't represent, a second language the same way that somebody who's been hearing it in their house for their childhood will represent that language, but you can come pretty close. So things are plastic. You can learn that second language later on in life, and you probably won't be able to speak it exactly like a native speaker, but you can come close. A couple things to think about in terms of major breakdowns of individual differences, variables that we'll talk about. Of course, we have cognitive abilities. This is related to general intelligence and ways to break that down, especially language and dyslexia, a disability with language. We also have personality. So, emotional intelligence, the big 5 of personality. So a lot of times we have abilities which we think are more hardwired, which in some cases is a little more true, but not 100% hardwired. Whereas personality is less hardwired in terms of strong genetic influence and more a matter about what was the environment when that personality trait likely developed. So what age was that person when their responsibility kicked in, and did they have the things in the environment that reinforced responsible behavior, for example? Continuing the idea of critical, or in this case, some of these are more sensitive periods. You see, if we look at, for example, vision and hearing, basically very sensitive in the first year. So once you get past a year, assume you've been exposed to plenty of visual and auditory or hearing stimuli. Your brain has mapped those pathways, and then you can basically hear after age 1 to 2 like you will the rest of your adult life, like any other person who has normal visual processing and hearing processing. As I said before, language is hugely sensitive in the first year of life, but it stays very sensitive too. And so the curve, there's still development, less total development, but still a lot more development relative to some of these that have these very sharp curves. I won't go into too much detail because this one takes a lot of background to set up. But basically, how do you test a baby? And you can't just ask them questions because they don't even have the language, first of all, to understand it, and then second of all, to be able to respond. But basically, one way to test babies is to have different things or different stimuli on the left or the right, and then you measure how far they turn to one or the other. And what we see is that if you grew up in a monolingual versus a bilingual house, we see that there are clear differences in orientation times. So basically, if a baby grows up in a monolingual house, they orient themselves to the English speaker very quickly, whereas the bilingual can distinguish between the languages, but it takes a little bit longer. So it may be the idea that bilingual brains are forming in a different way that makes them perhaps a little bit less efficient to track language early in life. But of course, those pathways are going to be beneficial later in life in being able to speak multiple languages. So let's look at some of the primary perspectives that we'll come back to throughout the semester from time to time. Chapter 2 is going to be heavy on the evolutionary biological perspective. What do genes and DNA tell us about how someone's going to develop? We'll also talk about brain structures. What is normal brain development? What is abnormal brain development? And of course, another physical aspect is hormones. Huge importance in biology, especially in times of puberty, as we'll find out. We also see the cognitive perspective. So this is basically, what are people thinking? How do we measure your cognitive ability through general intelligence or IQ, your thought patterns? How do you represent what you know and understand versus how can you express it and communicate with others? So there's lots of different things that we can fold into the cognitive perspective. We also have the learning perspective, and we think about learning as like learning something by reading a textbook, but in our case, this is more similar to the old B.F. Skinner, operant conditioning, Bandura, observational learning. How do we learn to be responsible? How do we learn what to be scared of? How do we learn what we think is going to provide us with a reward? And a lot of that's conditional on whatever environment we grow up in. So for example, most homes should support exploration of identity, especially terrible twos. You know, they can be bad, but it's actually a good thing because that offers teachable moments to, through the learning perspective in part, teach them behaviors that they should avoid that lead to things they don't like and punishment, and also be there to reward the good things that they'll, if rewarded properly, they'll be more likely to do and more likely to lead to successful outcomes as they develop and grow. We also have the contextual perspective. Here's one that I won't talk about much. This is more of a sociological view. We'll have an example coming up later that shows how this is systems oriented from very small family level to macro societal or country level. And it's not as if these aren't relevant, but I think for most of the things we'll talk about, the kind of research we want to find picks out a few key variables that are most relevant to that concept and just focuses on those rather than trying to figure out all the variables that might be involved, which the contextual, to me, often seems like it's trying to do. We'll talk a little bit about evolutionary psychology today and also expand on that in chapter 2. So we see that it's interactional, bidirectional, meaning nature and nurture. Sometimes nature causes nurture. Sometimes things in nurture cause nature. So which genes are expressed, which are inhibited? How does our genes program us in some ways to explore our environments and other times to fight or flight, to leave? And one big thing or concept or pattern that we'll talk about a lot is this idea of behavior genetics. Meaning when we talk about genetics, and again, I'm no geneticist, so I'm just going based on some of the stuff, the genetics research in classes I've had, however few they might be. We're not just looking at one or two genes that are linked to, for example, a certain illness, like, for example, Tay-Sachs disease or Huntington's disease. Instead, we're looking at explaining behavior. So why is someone aggressive? Why is someone a musical genius? Is there any genetic link with that? And chances are there's going to be lots of genes involved, And it's like the actuarial car perspective in car insurance, which means that just because you're a male or just because you drive a certain car doesn't mean you're more dangerous than somebody else. But statistically, those are risk factors for the company having to pay more money for you in some way or another. So I think one thing to be careful about is we can look at how genes can have links to many aspects of our behavior and our thoughts. But we want to be careful to say that bad genes usually do not fully explain behavior or even come close to it. So behavior, as we know now, we know can be predicted to some extent by genes, but it's dangerous to say things like certain genetic or ethnic groups are much more likely to be criminals because of their genes. That is not supported by the research. Let's talk about some of the big names in terms of lifespan development. First of all, we've already talked about Erikson, and again, we're going to hear what Erikson has to say about each general phase or stage of the lifespan. He was known, of course, for his psychosocial development and was, as we found out, takes the lifespan, chops it up into a bunch of age ranges, and then tries to identify the key factors for identity and ego formation, and particularly the development of self and intending and acting in your environment to be able to activate or create outcomes that you're seeking. Now, we won't talk about Freud much this semester, but he did come up with his psychosexual stages, which now we don't think there was too much to support that theory, although he did notice some interesting patterns that we can still see. So he identified patterns of behavior, but his theory for the causes of that unconscious, irrational stuff, not so much. So you don't have to know any of this for the exam, but know that if Freud hadn't done his psychosexual stages, Erikson might not have been inspired to make the lasting contribution to lifespan that he ultimately did and that we still appreciate to this day. Especially with child development, we will be coming to Piaget a lot, and basically he came up with four general phases of cognitive development. So at what age, this is the age graded part, what should a child be able to do? And if they can't solve that problem that most kids that age can, is that potentially an indicator for the need to intervene or the need to look for maybe a medical or cognitive issue? Now, we also have kind of in contrast to Piaget, which was focusing very much on the individual. Can you do this or not? Vygotsky was more from a Marxist culture, and that influenced his thinking. Instead of showing whether a child can do it or not, he came up with basically for any task, you can come up with a range around it called the zone of proximal development. And what that means is whether someone can get, especially a kid, whether they can get a problem right or wrong, is not giving you hardly any information about whether they're close to, if they do get it wrong. And so are they paying attention to the right things? Are they going through the right stages of solving the problem, or are they not even close? Are they not even understanding some of the words? So instead of yes, no, can you get it right or not, it is how much help do you need before you can look like you understand the right answer. And so he referred to that help as scaffolding. So temporary support or some temporary help. So for example, a kid might, crossing the street, can cross the street and knows how to do it safely, but in that moment they're not going to be thinking about it because they're too focused on something else. They're not used to running through the, oh, this is potentially dangerous, I need to stop, I need to look both ways. But that simple matter of just holding that kid's hands might be enough to then, to kick in the rest of that script. And then they'll look both ways, they'll look to see if any cars are coming, and so forth. I mentioned before that the sociocultural perspective is related to the contextual, and it is looking at the theory of everything. So in this case, you can model individual factors such as demographics, age, race, ethnic status, gender. And then you move out to the family and the school, and then various greater systems till you get to the macro system. And then you can even complicate all that with longitudinally over time. Not to say that nothing about that theory isn't right, but it's also more conceptual because you can't really statistically measure all those things at once to understand the person. And so for our purposes, some questions we have are going to be more based on the larger system, the socioeconomic status of a certain region of the country. Other things are going to be very personal, like individual differences of personality and intelligence. So we'll just take a part of this and a part of the age range, and that'll be enough to answer a lot of the questions that we're going to ask at various times this semester. Anytime we are at the beginning of a semester, I think it's important to talk about how do we come to understand some of the findings that we talk about. And basically, this is the kind of science that's done and why is it done this way. So first of all, we'll talk about some two general kinds of data. The first is qualitative, meaning not number-based or subjective. Another way to think about this is holistic. So this is Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote the book Nickel and Dime. She left her credit cards and her car and got a ticket to a city and tried to get a minimum wage job and just try and pay the bills and live. And she found it was, not surprisingly, very difficult. So especially when you're immersed in a culture, so in this case, immersed in being a waitress in the Deep South for 2 months, that's a great example of the ethnography perspective. And again, it's holistic because you really understand those people you're interacting with on a regular basis. But it's also harder to make general conclusions because you don't have the numbers. Now, if you do have the numbers, then you've taken the quantitative or numbers-based perspective. And here we see tests, surveys, physiological measures. These are all types of ways, and we're all familiar with many other ways to quantify data. As we see, it's heavy on correlation. So for example, something like coronary disease, cardiovascular function could have hundreds of things in a person's lifestyle or medical history or family history that could be important. And so the quantitative perspective would try and identify a few key ones and then see if you can predict to a large degree whether somebody is likely to have cardiovascular difficulty in 10 years. But of course, we can also do experiments. This is where we introduce a ton of control. And so we try to have 2 or more groups. Everything's the same, except different levels of the independent variable. In this case, with the experiment, the benefit is you get to say, yes, we think this causes that. Just like the Perry Preschool project, we get to say that, yes, it looks like free preschool does cause reduced crime in adulthood. But it takes a lot of work to do an experiment. Also, generally the quantitative, unlike the qualitative, which is holistic and understanding someone fully, this is, hey, researchers just have a few things that they care about. They want to get those numbers from you, quantify you according to those variables, and then the rest, well, that's just error. And so sometimes the quantitative method can seem very impersonal. Also, I wanted to point out, just because something's statistically significant, meaning we have enough data to conclude that it does exist as opposed to not existing, doesn't mean it's actually a big effect. So you can have tons of things, especially given a big enough sample size, which is the case with a lot of lifespan research. They're taking or plugging into large government data tranches, and even small things are going to be statistically significant with a big sample. Once you have a bunch of things that are statistically significant, then you have to decide what are the different effect sizes, which are the big ones, and what's the cutoff for big enough to be important and to measure later on, or too small, even though it's there and important, not important enough compared to the other ones. So keep that in mind as we move through thinking about different study findings throughout the semester. I think the book does a good job of discussing the difference between kinds of change. So this is very important. Think about something that is an age-graded influence. So anything that's a critical period, you're taking ages, or you're taking Erikson's breakdown of psychosocial development. That's all age-graded. It's saying that at this age range, and because you're this age, these are the things that are important to you. And you need to deal with these in this age range. And of course, a lot of change is age-graded. This happens at this age, that happens at that age. Although age-graded might be the kind of change we instinctively come to first, it's important to notice that that's not the only kind of change. So if we look at, for example, differences between groups over time, some things can be history graded. So this means, for example, people in your cohort experience things that people in older or younger cohorts didn't experience. So war is the classic example, or something like the Great Depression, right? If you lived through the Great Depression as a 20-year-old versus a 50-year-old versus a 5-year-old, that might have big differences on things that happen to you later in your life. So for example, if you grew up during war and you were, for example, a young child when there were food shortages and limited access to education, well, chances are you're on average, your cohort is going to have lower job attainability. You might have lower general intelligence on average. It has nothing to do with age, but it's instead when you were young and when something like the experience of war can have the most impact on depriving you of things you need for development, you are basically disadvantaged. There's been a ceiling that's put on your later development that other cohorts who didn't live through wars when they were young children don't see the effects of. And then finally, we have non-normative influences. We have to acknowledge that some things happen to people, and since they're non-normative, they are unusual. They are the exceptions to the rule, as you can see some of these examples. And we try not to take too much stock into making conclusions about things that probably don't apply to other people or normal people. So like LeBron James is a classic example. How is he able to play into his late 30s, never had a major injury, he's still mostly explosive as he used to be? What's the secret that if we knew what he knew, can we be the next LeBron? Well, chances are we can do the cryogenic chamber, we can do the paleo diet, and we're just not going to experience aging like LeBron did. So some people non-normatively get lucky, some people non-normatively get unlucky, and those things aren't really informative to the rest of us. And finally, as we start to wrap up, lifespan looks at change and development over time, and we're looking at different ages, and we're looking at different experiences of 5-year-olds in 1920, 5-year-olds in 1950, 5-year-olds in 1980. And there's a couple different ways that we can commonly research changes over time. So for example, the first one is what's known as cross-sectional. So basically, this is at the same time, get information from a bunch of different age groups. So this is writ large what the US Census does. It's looking at every 10 years, where do people live, what are they doing as far as employment, what do they need as far as funding and social services. So the key is that cross-sectional is the easiest because you only have to collect data at one time. But the cross-sectional design is probably the least convincing when you find an age difference. So let's say you find that 40-year-olds right now are generally more aggressive than 20-year-olds. Well, is that because of something unique to that cohort that 40-year-olds experienced at younger ages that the 20-year-olds didn't? Or is it more a product of the 20-year-olds will get to that higher level of aggression as they age in 20 years later? The cross-sectional doesn't really allow us. It could be either one. Now let's say we want to have a stronger conclusion about change. In this case, over time. This is called the longitudinal method. So again, we are taking one group of people and getting some data from them, and then over time, sometime later, sometimes multiple times. This is the 49 and up series. It started as 7 up, and basically every 7 years they started with these British school kids and have tried to catch up with them and see how they've changed, see how they've grown. Now the one advantage here of the longitudinal study is that in some ways it controls for cohort effects, meaning you only have data from one cohort, and so you can see that whatever change happens over time, that's what was happening to that cohort. When I say it limits generalization, well, what about cohorts limited or born before or after the cohort in the longitudinal study? Well, the data from this one, we don't know how well it would generalize to older or younger cohorts. So you can see cross-sectional is the easiest. You can get the data you want at one point in time. Longitudinal, now you're committing to starting a study and usually years later finishing it. But there's still some problems with the conclusion. So what's the gold standard? Well, it's known as the sequential study. And as you'll see in a little bit, it combines elements of the longitudinal and the cross-sectional study. The challenges are, though, it's super expensive because, as you'll see, you're doing some cross-sectional and some longitudinal. And basically, it's time-consuming and the data is super difficult to analyze. I wouldn't feel qualified to analyze high-level sequential data, as you'll see in just a little bit. So here's an example of how you can tell the way a sequential study combines cross-sectional and longitudinal components. So for example, each 1 year, 1 point in time, is a separate cross-sectional study. So we have Denise who's 20, Carla who's 40, Betty who's 60, right? Different people or groups at the same time in history, and comparing, are they different on some variable or variables that we're interested in? Do they have different personality? Do they have different levels of dementia? And so some of that stuff is kind of obvious, right? But just because Anne is more likely to have or showing more signs of dementia than Betty, does that mean it's just a product of her being 20 years older? Or is it a product of maybe her having exposure to a less, I don't know, rich media environment previously, and that is more predictive of gender? So that might be a cohort effect. The truth is you can't tell just from the cross-sectional study. Of course, now each of these diagonal lines are a longitudinal study. So this is Annie, and we see we just catch up with her at 20-year increments. Now the sequential, though, every different year or every new time period folds in somebody of the initial age range. And so once again, this whole thing is a sequential study. Diagonal lines are same people over time, longitudinal, and vertical lines are cross-sectional studies, different ages measured at the same time. It's good to see data from an actual study. So now we're looking at a cross-sequential, or we can just call it sequential, for 11 to 17-year-old cohorts. So this is one cohort, one longitudinal study. And you can see that first cohort got measured at age 11 in 1976, and each year that cohort is on average a year older. And then in a true sequential design, each subsequent year, we can see how, for example, in 1976, we didn't just get that one start of a longitudinal study, but we did an entire cross-sectional study. We got data from each of these general age groups, can make comparisons about how they're the same, how they're the different, and then we can look to see how each of these cohorts diagonally has changed over time. And the big picture here, and it's a little bit too complicated for me to explain fully, but if you know what you're looking for, having all this data allows you to isolate for a longitudinal finding if you really want to, and control for cohort effects, or the opposite. You could control for longitudinal or age-graded factors or variables, and then focus in on or isolate cross-sectional types of variables. And finally, as we wrap up, you can see a sequential design for all sorts of different things. And it doesn't have to be people. In this case, it is Atlantic cod in the Gulf of Maine. And you might want to look at certain things such as, why was this cohort so big? But why did it have such a fast die-off compared to some of the others, right? What were some of the reasons that can explain some cohorts being big, some cohorts being smaller? And with this kind of data, if you've got the right software and you've got the right analyst, you can learn lots of things and answer a lot of different questions. But again, it's expensive, it's hard to do, and you really have to know what you're doing. And finally, I won't go into much more detail on this. Here's more what a true sequential study would look like, and you can see I'm not even going to go into any of these effects, but you can see how kind of complicated concepts such as intercepts and slopes, and you can compare the cohort with the longitudinal, and you can make all sorts of modeling assumptions, adding in parameters that you're fixing versus letting those parameters get specified themselves. So there's all sorts of choices that can be very difficult and technical that you have to make to analyze sequential data. But again, it answers questions that no other study can. All right, thanks for hanging in. I know we're just about an hour here, so I appreciate your patience, and I hope you got something out of this and have found something that we can discuss in class or on the discussion boards. Thank you.